Have you ever wondered how a court in Perth and a court in Sydney can look at two really similar cases, maybe years apart, and somehow land on the exact same conclusion? Well, the answer is this powerful legal idea called precedent. It's pretty much the backbone of Australia's entire justice system. So let's dive in and figure out how this whole thing works.
Right, so think about the huge challenge courts face every single day. How do you make sure a decision made on a Tuesday in Sydney is treated with the same logic as a similar case from 10 years ago in Melbourne? I mean, without some kind of system, you just have chaos, right? It would be a total free-for-all. And that's where the system of precedent comes in. It's basically a framework that makes sure the wisdom from past decisions helps guide the ones being made today. It creates this consistent legal landscape that's built on principles that have already been tried and tested. Now, to really get a grip on how this works, let's step out of the courtroom for a minute and into a place that might be a bit more familiar, a high-end chef's kitchen. Trust me, this analogy is going to make everything click. Okay, picture this. The High Court of Australia, they're the head chef. They're the ones creating the master recipes. And the lower courts, well, they're all the junior chefs. Their job is to follow the head chef's recipes down to the letter. This makes sure that every dish, or in our case, every decision, that leaves the kitchen is consistent and totally up to standard. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, not everything the head chef says is a strict command. This brings us to a super important distinction in the world of precedent, the difference between rules that are binding and rules that are just persuasive.
So you can see the two types laid out here. On one side, you have binding precedent. This is like the core recipe. It is coercive, which means the junior chefs absolutely must follow it, no exceptions. But on the other hand, you have persuasive precedent. Think of this like the head chef's personal tips and tricks. Really helpful guidance, for sure, but not something you have to do.
Okay, we've had our fun in the kitchen. It's time to swap our chef's hats for wigs and gowns and learn the proper legal jargon for these ideas. We're talking about the reason for a decision versus an aside.
And this table just lays it all out perfectly. That core recipe, the binding reason for the decision, has a fancy Latin name, ratio decidendi. And those helpful chef's tips, the things a judge just says, by the way, those are called obiter dicta. So the main thing to remember is ratio is the rule and obiter is the advice.
So let's zoom in on ratio decidendi. This isn't just some small part of the judgment. It is the absolute foundation of the whole thing. It's the core legal principle, the reason for the decision that everything else is built on. And when the High Court, our head chef, lays down a ratio, it becomes binding law for every single lower court in Australia.
Now, let's talk about obiter dicta. This is where judges might explore what-if scenarios, offer some personal opinions, or just comment on the law in a broader sense. Now, while these asides aren't binding, don't underestimate them. They can be incredibly influential. In fact, some of the early ideas for the landmark Mabo decision actually started out as obiter in other cases, kind of signaling where the law might be headed in the future.
Okay, so we get the hierarchy, right? The top-down flow from the High Court. But what happens when we move sideways, across Australia's different states and territories? How does that work? This is a really important point. A legal principle that's established by a court in one state is not binding on a court in another state. So, a decision from the Supreme Court of Victoria is only persuasive for a court in New South Wales. They'll definitely look at it and respect it, but they don't actually have to follow it. Remember, only the head chef, the High Court, makes the rules for the whole country.
So we've gone through the mechanics, the kitchen analogies, all the legal jargon. But let's just take a step back and ask the big question. Why does this whole system of precedent actually matter so much? Why should we care? Well, it matters because this system is really the bedrock of fairness in our legal system. It creates predictability, so you and I have a pretty good idea of what to expect from the law. It ensures consistency so that similar cases get treated in a similar way. Put those two together and you get what we're all after, fairness. And finally, through those persuasive opinions, the obiter dicta, it gives the law a way to evolve slowly and thoughtfully over time, adapting to new social values without just throwing everything into chaos. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If a judge's aside, their obiter dicta, is powerful enough and persuasive enough, could it one day become the core reason, the ratio decidendi, of a future landmark case? It's a fascinating question, and it really shows you that the law isn't static. It's always evolving. And today's helpful tip just might become tomorrow's binding recipe. Thanks for tuning in.